During the mid-20th century, a class of low-level government officials created a suburban neighborhood at the edge of the city of East St. Louis, Illinois. Situated high on top of a bluff overlooking the city, people with power and influence moved from the center of town up the hill to this neighborhood called Hilltop. Everything appeared to be going well in the city below, but in truth, it was already in decline. Deindustrialization was moving money out of the city quickly, and people were moving out with it. My project focuses on this hilltop neighborhood as a way to explore the ongoing relationships across the urban and suburban divide. These people did not fully abandon East St. Louis when they built this suburban neighborhood. They continued to be active in their city. By exploring the idea of place that they generated in their new community, I am hoping to reveal the motivations behind their social and political decisions which ultimately shaped the city of East St. Louis. In order to answer my research questions, I need to have a deep understanding of suburbanization and of the history of East St. Louis. Most of the literature written about East St. Louis tries to answer what went wrong during the rise and fall of the city. These scholars tend to focus on broad forces and a handful of key people. They identify race relations, deindustrialization, urban planning failures, and long-term corrupted function of government as some of the main contributors. The most comprehensive history currently available about East St. Louis is written by Andrew J. Theising. He identifies deindustrialization as the main broad force in the rise and fall of East St. Louis. He highlights the role that vice and private gain played in the economic and political decisions of city leaders. Race relations is part of his story, but is not identified as a root cause. He concentrates a chunk of the blame on the white political machine that favored private gain over public good. Theising's work is solid and the most useful literature available for this type of study to date. However, he leaves out the cultural and social forces at play. East St. Louis has been studied by other political scientists, plus philosophers, sociologists, and urban planners. They leave plenty of room for a historian to add to this literature base by studying lower-level government officials and individual citizens from a cultural perspective. Suburbanization is well studied across multiple disciplines and heavily focused on the post-World War II suburban trend. Grounded in broad-based demographic changes, scholars identify deurbanization, changes in transportation and construction technologies, issues with race and poverty, and governmental policies and programs as some of the main forces for this change. Kenneth T. Jackson's Crabgrass Frontier, the Suburbanization of the United States, sets the model for this type of study. He characterizes suburbanization by home ownership, population density, long journey to work, and residential status. He attributes suburban ideals, flight from cities, often due to rising poverty and racial issues, and transportation technology changes as main causes for the influx of suburban living. He does consider governmental policies, changing construction methods, and low land prices as contributing factors also. Since Jackson, literature mostly treats the suburbs as a mass movement of white middle-class people abandoning the city center. Although this is mostly true, it does not consider that some of the people who moved to these suburbs were still active in and influencing places like East St. Louis. The historiographies of East St. Louis and suburbia offered solid arguments for how and why changes occurred for them. The arguments may be strong and settled well enough, but they are incomplete. This is why I would like to look at the ongoing relationships across the urban and suburban divide and use the Hilltop neighborhood as my focus. I would like to explore how the experience of living in a place like Hilltop shaped the political decisions of this class of lower-level government officials who continued to be an active part in the governance of East St. Louis, the city they supposedly abandoned. How did this lower-level governmental class of people view themselves and their city? What can their motivations, dreams, and ideals that they had for this neighborhood reveal about the decisions they made with governing East St. Louis? My project is grounded in the studies of suburbanization, spatial history, and the social scientific studies of East St. Louis, but I will shift to a cultural historical perspective. East St. Louis will be my urban center, while Hilltop will be my suburb. I will look at the city as a place not abandoned by those who moved out, but will instead examine how these Hilltoppers generated an idea of place which influenced how they continue to govern the city from their new homes. My great-grandfather, who was a police officer and Democratic Precinct Committee member in East St. Louis, purchased 3 plots of land in Hilltop in 1950. He built 3 homes there between 1951 and 1965. His children and grandchildren also lived in these homes on and off until the early 1990s. This personal connection I have to this neighborhood provides access to stories, photographs, documents, and home movies from this neighborhood during this period. It also opens up connections to other families who were their neighbors. I plan to conduct oral histories with people from at least 5 of these families. By having them tell me what Hilltop meant to them, why they chose to live there, and what the experience was like, I am hopeful to gain insight into what the idea of place was in this community. To understand Hilltop even better, I can also look at the homes people built and how the neighborhood itself was constructed by looking at real estate records, blueprints, city directories, plat maps, site plans, and photographs. I can get a sense of how they moved through their homes by looking at the construction and noticing if their homes were small or large, or if there were many rooms or few. This could tell me if the movement encouraged interaction or separation and isolation. Looking at how they moved through their homes and neighborhood could reveal their motives and information about their daily lives and behavior. Along the way, I can look for symbolic associations within the neighborhood or their homes. Maybe there was an empty lot used as a gathering place for neighborhood kids to play, to form lifelong friendships and memories. They may have saw it as symbolically more than just an empty lot. The neighborhood itself could be a symbolic place. Situated high on the bluff overlooking the city, they could have felt safer and better off than those who lived below. To find answers to these questions beyond what I will get out of the oral histories, I can search advertisements, maps, government and business documents, and newspaper articles. In conclusion, Hilltop is a neighborhood on the edge of East St. Louis. Using a cultural history approach grounded in suburbanization, social scientific studies of East St. Louis, and spatial history, I can focus on the place these people of influence created for themselves. This can potentially reveal motivations and insight into the choices they made for the governance of the city itself. This is an approach on a smaller level that I have not run across yet. I believe it can deepen the understanding of the urban-suburban divide, which is how cities like East St. Louis were shaped.